Okay, well, I encourage you to turn in your Bibles to the book of Judges. We're continuing our study here, and as I mentioned last week, the end of chapter 8 of Judges is really a transition into the story of Abimelech. But we're going to talk in that passage, or look at the passage in Judges 8:29 through 35 that describes the end of Gideon's life and the seedbed in which the life of Abimelech, his son, will grow in. So let me read it for you, and then we'll go through a study of the text. Judges 8, verse 29. Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and lived in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, for he had many wives. And his concubine was in Shechem, and his concubine who was in Shechem also bore him a son, and he called his name Abimelech. And Gideon, the son of Joash, died in a good old age and was buried in the tomb of Joash's father at Ophrah of the Abiezrites. As soon as Gideon died, the people of Israel turned again and whored after the Baals and made Baal Berit their god. And the people of Israel did not remember Yahweh their God, who had delivered them from the hand of all their enemies on every side. And they did not show steadfast love to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in return for all the good that he had done to Israel. Well, this passage raises up a few issues. So I thought originally my goal was to try and get through the end of 8 all the way through 9, which if you look at it is like 57 verses. And the reason being, it's a lot of narrative, and you don't, it's a story, so you want to take it as one piece. But I think we'll do well just to consider the introduction to Abimelech's life, which has to do, of course, with the end of Gideon's, but not just the end of it, but some of the facets of his life, which we did not hear of until this point in the text, namely the family life of Gideon. We get a little bit of a reference to it when we were in that passage regarding Zebah and Zalmunna, who were the two Midianite kings, and Gideon wanted his son to execute them. So we got a little glimpse of maybe his parenting style there, but we're going to see a little bit more in depth about this. And the main theme of this section is going to be, heading into Judges 9 as well, that the legacy of Gideon is tainted by the children of Gideon. There's going to be two main problems that we're going to see and talk about a little bit tonight. And the first one is the problem of polygamy, and then next will be the problem of the next generation without regeneration. We'll talk about that when we get there. Polygamy is the word for having many spouses. And we see there that at the end of Jerubbaal, which is another name for Gideon. Remember, Jerubbaal means struggles with Baal, and it's a sort of a nickname he earned at the beginning of his story when he tore down those altars that his father had put up. He goes back home, and the text informs us, almost casually, that he had 70 kids from many wives. Now, polygamy was a rampant practice of the ancient Near East. Even many civilizations today still have polygamy, except countries that have had a heavy Catholic or Protestant influence. Now, that's a generalization, I know, but for the most part, it holds. And it's because Christians, for the past 2,000 years, have consistently condemned polygamy. Even beyond what we'll see in the New Testament, it's clear that even the earliest church fathers, so that generation of men who pastored churches after the apostles died, after Revelation was written, the early church fathers were critical of polygamy and supported monogamy. That is, that one man, one woman for life sort of definition of marriage. Now, why is this a confusing issue then? Because I know many look at the Old Testament with a little bit of confusion, because it seems like so many people in the Old Testament had many wives. And it also seems like the writers of Scripture, and even God himself, seem to rarely condemn the practice of polygamy. So because you see it in so many people, even people that are mentioned in the book of Hebrews 11 as being a part of the hall of faith, like Gideon and David and Abraham and Jacob, they were all polygamists. So you think, well, I mean, I'm a little confused here. If polygamy is so wrong, how come they're in the hall of faith? And then secondly, it's odd that it seems like God rarely ever condemns it, or the narrator or the writer of the text rarely ever makes a commentary about its goodness or badness, so to speak. Well, I want to clear that up for you today, hopefully by the end of it, and you won't have any more questions about why that happens and whether God is agnostic or, doesn't really care about polygamy. The first point is this, that the Bible assumes monogamy. The Bible assumes a relationship between one man and one woman. And you don't have to go very far into the first book of the Bible, in Genesis 2, to see that God's design for marriage was that one man and one woman would come together and become one flesh. Genesis 2. 2:24. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. It's 1 + 1 = 1. It is a man and a woman coming together as one. And you might say, well, that's not really talking about marriage. I mean, this is Adam and Eve. This is the beginning of all things. So that doesn't necessarily extend to every couple, all civilizations, and all people around the world. But Jesus actually affirms that, no, this is the genesis of marriage is in Genesis. In Mark chapter 10, verse 8, when he is asked a question about divorce, and it was a question not asked with a genuine, sincere heart to know the answer, but rather to try and stumble him, Jesus responds to the question of divorce this way. Let's start in verse 5, or verse 6. Mark 10:6. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. That's directly in response to a question about marriage, and Jesus clearly affirms that Genesis 2:24 is talking about the institution of marriage, and within it is that equation that one man and one woman equals one flesh. So clearly that is the biblical pattern and precedent. Not only that, you have in the wisdom literature, in the book of Proverbs, many a proverb that speaks of the dangers of adultery, the dangers of having multiple wives, an assumption that you ought to only have one wife. And then in Proverbs 31, at the end of the book of Proverbs, it is dedicated to finding or acknowledging an excellent wife in the singular. It'd be very hard to interpret these words to suggest that you are to find multiple of these excellent women. The idea is you're lucky if you find one. Similarly, if you look at the Song of Solomon, which is another wisdom book, but it is either written by Solomon or dedicated to Solomon, and it is poetic literature about the love of one man and one woman in a marital context. It'd be very awkward to read that book from a non-monogamous standpoint, to see this man and this woman expressing their love and adoration for each other and how beloved the other is, and for him to be saying that, say, to multiple women, or for the woman to say that to multiple men, it is assuming monogamy. For it to work as the poetry it is, it cannot be referring to someone who could easily interchange this devotion to another woman and another woman and another woman. So those are examples, at least in the Old Testament, where monogamy is just a tacit assumption or an ideal. Of course, when we come into the New Testament, we have the analogy that Paul makes in Ephesians 5, which we've studied in the past few months, where Paul speaks of the nature of the relationship between a man and a woman, or a husband and a wife, as being like that of Christ and his church. And here's clear that the church, or Christ, has but one bride, the church. That's an assumption. That's how this works, because you cannot imagine a situation where a woman would have multiple husbands that she is to submit to equally, or that a man would have to have a lay down your life sort of love for multiple women. It doesn't say that exactly, but it's clear the assumption is we're talking about one man and one woman, just as we're speaking of one Christ and one church. And that is a word picture that you see all throughout Revelation. You don't need to go to all the chapters there, but Revelation 19:7, Revelation 21:9, Revelation 22:2, Revelation 22:17, it speaks of Christ and his bride, singular, the church. It is assumed. One husband, one wife. And when you look at 1 Timothy 3:2, the qualifications of the leaders of the church, the elders, is that they are a one-woman man. And this is not like, well, the pastor can't be polygamous, but everyone else can. The idea is when you look at the qualities and qualifications of an elder, these are qualities everyone, man, woman, child, if they are a follower of the Lord, should be striving for, attaining to. It's just that for sure these qualities must be present in an elder, but they are qualities that all believers should be striving for. So in that sense, being a one-woman man is something that all men in a church should be striving for and attaining to. So there's just an assumption that monogamy is what we mean by marriage and God's ideal for it. Secondly, we can see that the Bible is clear about the consequences of polygamy. In a way, it doesn't have to say, it's a big no-no that he had multiple wives, when you have a text like Gideon, which we'll get into. He had multiple wives, 70 kids, and you're going to find out that one of the brothers is going to commit fratricide. It's a genocide fratricide. I mean, he wipes out his own bloodline, is what's going to happen here. So it's clear by the consequences of the polygamy that this was not a good thing. But you could also look at the patriarchs and many of the kings and so on of Israel, that polygamy always introduced, or almost always introduced, severe problems. So you have Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. And you have the issue where there was a conflict between Hagar and Sarah over having kids. And so Abraham has a kid with Hagar, Ishmael, and then he has a kid with Isaac, and there's conflict there. So you don't necessarily need the narrator to say this was a big no-no when you have in the text right after that Hagar is abused and kicked out because Sarah can't stand her anymore. That Isaac and Ishmael are going to have interpersonal conflicts with each other. The text is clear by consequence that having multiple wives was not a good thing. You have Jacob, who had the 12 tribes, of course, were his sons, but there was jealousy and rivalry that happened as well between his wives, one who felt more loved than the other, and you can read the drama there. And that's where some of the issues with Joseph comes up because of polygamy. The reason that Joseph ends up in a pit and being sold is because he is the child of favor. So David, he ends up fleeing for his life because of one of his kids trying to kill him. A rivalry that would not have come up if he didn't have a few wives, Bathsheba and Michal and Abigail. So this is not, it is clear in almost every case where there is any real advertised, the Bible takes some time to talk about a person that has many wives, where it does not result in an ugly outcome, one way or the other. One commentator writes this: The hatred and murder that plagued Gideon's family are characteristic of Old Testament polygamous situations, meaning hatred and murder tend to accompany polygamy. So I don't need to tell you, the Bible doesn't need to tell you, or God doesn't need to say as if you're children, don't have multiple wives. Although in Deuteronomy 17:17, it does say the kings should not have multiple wives because his heart will go after them. He doesn't need to say it because the consequences are obvious, because the pattern was set very clearly in Genesis 2:24. You don't need to keep reiterating it as if we are fools. We can see by the consequences. And it's not that God cannot use a polygamist or a sinner in general. Obviously not. But the Bible seems to be teaching by way of consequence and not explicit condemnation that having multiple wives multiplies problems. Now, I thought it might be helpful. Let's talk about, real fast, some notable monogamous relationships. Well, Adam and Eve, notable monogamous relationship in the Bible. We don't hear that Adam had any other wives except Eve. It would be hard to imagine him pursuing any other wife when there in the garden, here is the Lord saying explicitly, this is your flesh, this is your bone, you two have become one flesh, this is it. It would just, there's no way he was going to cheat, on Eve after something like that. Another notable monogamous couple, Isaac and Rebekah. He has a very, in a sense, bland testimony in the Bible. He's obviously offered up by Abraham as the child of promise, so that's kind of what he's noted for. But his only other notable quality is that he intensely loved Rebekah. And he was faithful to her. You don't get anything really out of that, except then he had Jacob and Esau, the twins. But that wasn't his fault or anything. Well, yeah, it wasn't his fault that they had a rivalry. So Isaac actually, when it comes to some of the figures in Genesis, there's not a whole lot negative to say about him. And isn't it interesting that he also was monogamous? He's faithful to his wife. You have Moses and Zipporah. Moses being, of course, a preeminent prophet of the Old Testament. It's never said anywhere that he had any other wife except Zipporah. And then Ruth and Boaz, David's parents. Now, it's not said explicitly that Boaz was not married. Some say, well, how could he have had so much prominence and be so well off without having been married beforehand? Well, there's nothing in the text suggests that Boaz had other wives or anything like that, and he didn't get any wives after Ruth. So, of course, being David's parents and having that kind of upbringing would have been advantageous. But that's about it. At least as far as kind of explicit monogamous couples, there's not many in the Old Testament. Huh? Oh, in the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, yeah, of course, in the New Testament, Mary and Joseph is notable. Actually, that's a good point. I didn't, still Old Testament. Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough, Bill. Fair enough. You're right. Fair enough. That's very true. Mary and Joseph. Very good. Very good. Thank you. I'll add that to my notes after, so let's make sure it's in here. John the Baptist's parents? Oh, that's probably true too. Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true. So I kind of constrain myself. So I'm not saying there's none in what in the text of the New Testament. I'll put it that way. Yeah. No, it's a good question. This came up actually in the discussion. I'll get to this in a second, maybe more. But just the idea of having good examples in the Bible. You start thinking, maybe there's not a whole lot. There are, but they're all flawed. Well, we'll get to that at the end. It's just interesting when you think, if it's such a virtue and a value, monogamy, how come there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of examples of it? And, in this case, the culture at the time was not very, didn't have much of an affinity for monogamy. Now, commentators will say, I'll add this just because this is what theologians will also mention beyond what I just said, to make sense of these polygamy passages, is that there wasn't a lot of protections for women at that time, and so it was like a kindness to bring a woman under your household to care for them. And so it is sort of a social net. It could be seen as a generous or hospitable thing. I'll be honest, I don't necessarily buy that because it's kind of clear that having multiple wives leads your heart astray. And maybe it kind of legitimizes it if it's a civilly recognized arrangement or something like that. Okay, but you just don't have good examples. If that's true, it's like a good thing. Well, you just don't have any examples where it turns out super well. Think of Solomon, of course, having 1,000 wives and concubines and how that turned out for him. Anyway, what was that? Noah. Well, they actually say that it's interesting that Noah in the ark was preserved for like monogamous couples. Noah and his wife, and then his 3 sons and their wives. So those would be notable monogamous couples. Although you wonder if that was imposed by the constraints where God is like, you can take your 3 kids and 3 wives and not more than that. You would think, anyway, we don't necessarily have to get into the weeds with that, but it is interesting that on the ark are preserved for 4 couples like that. So certainly God had a pattern that he was trying to hold to. Anyway, this is an interesting point. Now, this might be a case where this is another failed test of Gideon, as we spoke last week. We can't say for sure whether he amassed these wives before God called him to be a judge or after. Meaning, did he have all of these wives in Genesis 6 as he is out there secretly trying to thresh the wheat in hiding because the Midianites are oppressing the Israelites? And did he have all these wives before or at that time? Or did he accrue these wives after he rescued all of Israel, after he was this great war hero, after he was this judge? I say it like that because I get the impression that these wives were something that happened after he became a judge, after he was someone sort of impressive, after he was someone that had quite a name attached to him. I can't say for certain, but I assume it'd be easy. If you wanted to add some wives after you had this list of accolades and achievements and saved everyone's life, that you could create quite a harem for yourself. That's just a little bit of me, but in any case, this was not God's ideal. That's all I'm trying to say with bringing up this issue of polygamy. This is not God's design. It never turns out well. Gideon should have known better, and we're going to see the fallout of that in just a moment. Second problem that we see here is dealing with the next generation without regeneration, meaning a changed heart. Can you, this is the question that plagues, I think, a lot of believing families. Like, what can a believing parent do to make sure they are passing on their faith to their kids? And if I could promise you a silver bullet, no matter how difficult and toilsome it was, what believing parent would not be willing to jump through any amount of hoops if they could guarantee, their children could come to faith? But I'm jumping ahead of myself here. We hear here of 70 sons plus Abimelech, but don't get too attached to these 70 kids. I wonder if Gideon could have even kept track of that many names. After my second was born, Evie, I already started mixing up their names. And by each subsequent one, I essentially just start rattling off names until I get the right one, right? So I can't even imagine someone with 70 kids is really remembering, let's say, birthdays and spending quality time with their moms, and with them. And on top of that, the idea of a concubine is a little bit different than a wife, is that she probably stayed at home in Shechem with her dad, and Gideon was just expected to stop in from time to time, check in on the wife and the kids. It's like a rental wife. I mean, it's just not, that's an abysmal situation in any case. So So she was a low-ranking wife in that regard. The name Abimelech tells us a lot here. Abimelech was a generic name for a Philistine king. In fact, in Genesis 20, Abraham has an interaction with Abimelech. There's a conflict that arises there involving Sarah. So Abimelech was a title as well as a name, and it means either my father is a king or father of a king. Avi means like Av is like dad, and Melech is king. So here, especially what we see Abimelech try to accomplish, which is to become king, and perhaps as an ironic contrast to Gideon turning down the kingship, his name is meaningful. Remember, last week we saw that the people wanted him and his son and his grandsons to rule over them. In other words, they wanted to establish a dynasty and a monarchy to Gideon. And what did Gideon say? He said, I will not rule over you. My son will not rule over you. Yahweh will rule over you. Good answer, Gideon. But then why did you name your son, my father is a king? I was a little bit suspicious there. Now, at first I was like, oh, maybe it was the wife, who named the kid. But it very clearly says that he called his name Abimelech. Well, what is that, Gideon? And this is why some would say again that perhaps Abimelech was turning down the kingship on paper, but not really turning it down in his heart. Or, we suggested this last week, he didn't mind all the perks, maybe, of being a king, but not the responsibility. So you turn down the title, but in effect, you really are still functioning as king. In any case, this is a betrayal in some ways of Gideon's heart, I think, where he would have some of the audacity to either allow his wife to name his son this, or to name his son Abimelech. Now, I think here we also can make another interesting observation about passing on faith to the next generation, because it's going to become very obvious that there's going to be a lot of trouble with Gideon's children, and it's not a rare thing. Why does it seem to be so rare to find a faithful person successfully passing on faith to the next generation in the Bible? Again, kind of looking particularly at the Old Testament, and we see so much polygamy, and we think, no, this is not a good situation. And then we also see a lot of, and they go hand in hand, I think, we see so much parents, especially fathers, failing their children. We have many examples of this. David and Solomon. Arguably, if Solomon, if he was only half-hearted to the Lord, how is it that a man who is after God's own heart can raise up a son who is so selfish and proud? Now, maybe not by the end of his life when he writes Ecclesiastes, but certainly you could argue that he was a failure as a father. And then by the same token, Solomon, perhaps maybe figured it out by the end of his life, writes an entire book of Proverbs to his son so that he might fear the Lord, find a good wife, judge righteously, be full of wisdom, so that he can be a good king to his kingdom. What does his son do? Splits the kingdom, almost starts a civil war. Is a terrible king and not a very godly man. You have Eli, which we would see if we went all the way to 1 Samuel, the high priest, who was okay as a high priest, except he had a blind spot. His two sons, they're called worthless men. Just really, you don't see too many good examples of someone passing on the faith to the next generation. Now you do, there's perhaps some. You had one situation where one good king of Israel or Judah had a good kid. You had Asa and Jehoshaphat. So Asa was a good king. He had a son Jehoshaphat. He's a good king. Problem was, Jehoshaphat's kid was terrible, okay? He had some kind of good kings give birth to a kind of good king, and there's just, it's mixed review. There's no clear pattern, it seems like, and certainly you had some very good kings have very terrible children. The point being here, just as my thoughts turn to what do we do as parents, and what do we do as a church? We want to raise up kids in the next generation. What is it that we are supposed to do, and why does it seem so frustrating when we look to the Bible and want to see examples of that? And let's admit at the outset here that you cannot pass faith on to your kids in the same way that you pass on the color of your hair, right? Genetically. There is no way to guarantee a transmission of your faith to your kids' lives in that kind of very direct, DNA kind of way. As the saying goes, God has no grandchildren. Each must possess individually their own faith and trust in God and what he's done for us. On the other hand, you do have passages like Deuteronomy chapter 6, which commanded the Israelites that they must fear Yahweh your God, you and your son's son, by keeping all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you all the days of your life, that your days may be long. And then he says in verse 7, you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. In other words, there's obviously a command to pass on the commandments of God, to tell them, remind them of what the Lord has done. So often we see in Joshua and Judges that they forgot the Lord and forgot what he had done for their family, their parents, and their parents' parents. Certainly we see in the New Testament that the qualifications of an elder is that they have faithful children, and whether that means that the children actually have to be Christian or just that they need to be led by their parents and their father in a faithful manner such that they are at least being subject to the things of faith. The point is that even an elder must manage his own household well, be a good father and present there. And Ephesians also talks about how the children must obey their parents, and parents need to raise them up in the fear and instruction of the Lord. So on the one hand, it feels like, or it seems like, there's no guarantees that I can somehow, for sure, I follow this method, follow this program, can ensure that my kids will have faith, and I have to trust the Lord, and they have to put their own trust in the Lord. On the other hand, there's an obligation and duty for every parent to impart to their children the things of God and a godly example and godly testimony. That I wonder, as I had a long conversation, as I mentioned this morning, with a friend of mine who's a pastor friend who's all about family discipleship and children's ministry. And we talked for hours about this. It's such a burden that he has to see kids and young people come to the Lord, and knowing that parents, of course, must be instrumental in that. And yet also then to say, I know of faithful parents who did all they could. One kid turns out okay, and the other is all sideways. And some parents who did everything wrong, and then their kid is a pastor or a missionary. I don't know that I don't know that we came to any just methodology that would guarantee success as a parent, except to say that the Lord is certainly not going to bless inaction or passivity when it comes to parents raising their kids in the fear and admonition of the Lord. That clearly one of the dangers of polygamy is that it is not going to reflect godly character to try and love multiple wives and multiple children in a sacrificial way when you have competing interests when it comes to having multiple wives, that it's going to be difficult. I sort of have more of an idea of what not to do when it comes to a parent than what to do. But I know that what God is urging every family, every dad, and every mom is to be faithful to the Lord. And I think the least that you can say here with Gideon and what happens to his kids is that while Abimelech is certainly totally culpable for the murders he's about to commit to his parents, or to his brothers, there is some sense in which Gideon, his flaws and his failings also contributed to what his son turned out to be. It's just that both are true. Gideon didn't need to be a dad who never made mistakes. But I think we see enough evidence here at the end of Gideon's life that there were things that had an unfortunate or negative impact on his kids' lives. That, while he can't be culpable, Gideon not culpable for Abimelech's actions, for whatever part Gideon had, he would have needed to have repented of. I almost wished that I could talk about this section of raising up the next generation, why it seems so problematic, and have like an answer for you. Oh, just do this, just do that. But I don't, or else I'd be doing it and I could probably put it in a box and sell you a tape or a book or a conference about it. But the fact of the matter is what I can do is be faithful to the Lord as best as I can, and see my kids as the stewardship in the context of my faithfulness to the Lord, not to make the kid the idol, but also to make sure that I see that my relationship to them is a responsibility and a joy before the Lord. We cannot ensure regeneration, which is God transforming our hearts and making us born again. I cannot ensure that to the next generation, but I can do all I can to present a God who does change hearts and lives. And I can demonstrate to them that my own life has been changed by the Lord as well, and leave it to the Lord. But I'd love to get, this is one of those things where I'd love to get other people's insight about that. I spent hours, I mean, literally probably like 10 plus hours talking to my friend about this on this trip. And we did not exhaust it. So it was a very good conversation. So I'm planting a seed there. Don't have an application. Don't have a clear-cut answer. Just do this if you're a parent or you have young people in your life, and you can guarantee that they'll become saved or anything like that. But it's something certainly to care about. I'll just leave it at that. In any case, the stage is set. We see here that after this description of what happened with Abimelech, or the context of Abimelech's life, Gideon, the son of Joash, died in a good old age and was buried in the tomb of Joash, his father, at Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Good old age is another way of saying that he led a long, full life. And he dies and is buried in the tomb of his father, which is typical practice of the time. And I said here, once again, the cycle of Judges begins again, but it doesn't. It almost starts up, because right after he dies, the people of Israel turn again and whore after the other gods. But does God raise up a judge right away? No, we have this whole thing with Abimelech first. So it's a little bit atypical outside of the cycle of Judges, because you have this whole scene that happens, a whole chapter or so of the rise and fall of Abimelech. So it's not quite the same pattern of Judges. We'll talk about that more as we get into his life, but it does warrant our attention that this is saying something about Gideon and his relationship to his family and his son, because nowhere else in the book of Judges you see that kind of attention brought to a child of a judge and what happens and all this strife that's going to ensue and murder. So certainly God wants us to to focus in on this subject because, you don't see that kind of attention. We kind of break the pattern of Judges a little bit before we get to the next judge by talking about this. Now, there in verse 33, as soon as Gideon died, they go buck wild. It's just a terrifying and sad statement of the people's readiness and eagerness to go astray. Like a teenager just waiting to turn 18 and do all the stuff her parents told her she can't do. It just means that the rest and prosperity that Israel enjoyed, because it does say that they had rest for 40 years in the days of Gideon. And what it means is that while that rest that they enjoyed was real, it was also superficial. It was imposed, you could say, by Gideon's presence, much like parents can impose on the children up until they're 18, sort of these rules and things that it's gonna bless the kid, and the kid will prosper, and yet it doesn't mean that kid's heart is still not like, I'm so ready to go, I can't wait to do all this stuff. It is not a result of the changed hearts of the people, this rest. It is implying that, or maybe more than implying, that this was only Gideon that was holding them back. And I recall this example from a counseling book that sometimes a lot of parenting, but this has to do with just people in general too. Sometimes what we want is just to care about fruit, to be a fruit inspector. But there are times when you are tempted just to see stapled on fruit as good enough. So if your kid seems like they're okay, sort of says the right thing, you don't probe any deeper, but you look at it and it looks like there's all these apples on the tree. But if you were to go closer, you would notice that all these apples are just stapled on. They're not genuinely coming from this tree, but they're just stapled on there, and they're not really a product of the heart, of the kid. And sometimes as parents, what we'll even do is staple those fruits on ourselves, rather than perhaps do the hard work of making sure that our children are rooted and grounded in a faith. It's a temptation that we all face, I think, and I think we might say here that while they enjoyed rest, everything seemed okay on the surface, but underneath or in their heart or in their root was not a true relationship with the Lord, because as soon as he died, it was all over. They went right back to the Baals. And it's really sad here because it makes a mention of Baals. We talked about that before, just one of these idols. But it says they made Baal Berit their god. Well, Berit is the word for covenant. So it is like the covenant that Abraham, or that God made to Abraham. That was a covenant. That was a berit, right? So there's a double indictment here that they would come after Baal Berit, because the Israelites are a people born of, created from a covenant made between Yahweh and Abraham in Genesis 12 and in Genesis 15, where the covenant is actually cut. Back then they cut covenants like you cut a deal, but when they cut a covenant back then, they literally cut animals in half. And that was a way of saying, if I don't keep my end of the bargain, may it happen to me like happened to this animal that I cut in half. Right? That's the seriousness of that obligation and that duty. Now, it's interesting, Genesis 15, that God alone enters into that covenant, meaning God is saying, I am going to make sure this happens. It's not dependent upon you, Abraham, it's dependent on me. But anyway, they are a covenant people. God made a covenant with Abraham. That's why the Israelites are in this land. But now they're following Baal Berit. Not only that, Gideon himself, his name, Jerubbaal, which is mentioned earlier, was the nickname that he got from contesting and contending with Baal. It's who God raised him up to be in his period as a judge, as someone who would contend with Baal. So for them now to go after Baal Berit is an utter failure. It's to go back to square one, or even worse. by turning so quickly to Baal-berith, they demonstrated they had forgotten God and Gideon both. The narrator of the passage says that they did not show, not only did they forget God, but they did not show steadfast love to the family of Jerubbaal/Gideon. Word for steadfast love is a very important Hebrew word, chesed. It is a covenant love. It is a committed love to have, and it is a way of saying that they were unfaithful to what God represented as God's salvation from these pagan oppressors. Block, who I've been quoting a few times in the past couple sermons, who's kind of negative on Gideon, he says, in the person of Gideon, the narrator recognizes the schizophrenic nature of Israel's spiritual personality. On the one hand, she treasures her call to be God's covenant people. On the other, she cannot risk the allurements of the prevailing Canaanite culture. Maybe it's surprising, maybe it's not, that after all this, the narrator still says that Gideon had done good to Israel. That one of the condemnations against Israel is that they were not returning love or appreciation or commitment for all the sacrifices Gideon made and for the parts of his life that were faithful, that they were betraying that, and that he actually did good. Not necessarily that he was good in all that he did, but that he had done good. And I think we need to be thankful that God does do good through imperfect people. For all the criticisms we might have of Gideon's life, ultimately, we can affirm that God used him to do some very good work. It's not an affirmation of everything he did. It's to say that God accomplishes a good purpose even amongst sinners. And that's a hope. That's the very basis of our existence. The only reason I'm going to go to sleep and be okay and wake up tomorrow and be okay is the hope and the promise that God can do good and is doing good through a very imperfect person. So we want to read this and be thankful that despite all that we just read and said, that God's analysis is still, this was someone who had done good for Israel, not perfect. And of course, that sets up not only Abimelech's story, but it's setting up the larger story of the Bible, that we need more than just a faithful person to rule over Israel here. What we need is the faithful one to rule over Israel. And not just over Israel, but over all of us. That even whenever we see an inadequate, failed father or king or brother or priest or whatever it is in the pages of Scripture, it's not the end of the story. It's simply pointing us to the need for a great Savior, an eternal God who will come as a man and be the kind of we're in an election cycle. I don't know if you knew this. We're in an election year this year. And if you're like many, just looking at the chaos that is unfolding before our eyes with regards to candidates and just everything, the whole mess of it. I'm not trying to tell you who to vote for or anything like that, but I think we would all agree it's just a mess. It's chaos. Sometimes I'm just disgusted to turn on the news or read another article about the politics. Whenever that happens, you have an opportunity to be thankful to God for Jesus, an actual king in the flesh who is not like these flawed men we see here or these flawed men that we see on TV and on the internet. You ought to be thankful instead of despairing when you see this. Say, good thing my king is Jesus. Good thing my kingdom is the new heavens and the new earth. Good thing my citizenship is not on earth, but in heaven with him. And then from there, you can have your political preferences. Then from there, you can say, well, who is doing good? God is using to do good despite being imperfect people. That's okay. And, again, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for or anything like that. But first thought, first stop, first hope, first joy, first comfort when you see the kings and the presidents and the nations or prime ministers of the world, whatever you might think about them, be thankful for Jesus. And if you're not a Christian tonight, and if your hope is in flawed men, flawed women, if it is in being a good mom, good dad, or blaming that you had a bad mom or a bad dad, all those things will not stand before a holy God who's going to say, well, you had this moment and this life to do what was right in my eyes, to do what is truly good. And we've all fallen short of that. If you're not a Christian tonight, we cannot blame the government. We cannot blame our parents. We cannot blame our upbringing or our culture. We will stand before God and we will know that we had done wrong, eyes wide open. We had no other reason to not do the right thing, and we chose what was wrong, and we ought to be judged or condemned for it. But the grace of God and the mercy of God is that he did send a king to rule over us. But what he did first was to lay down his life for his people. How many kings, presidents, prime ministers have ever died for their people, for their sake, for their good, for their benefit? Oh, I'm sure it's a short list. But that is our king who did that in his great love and compassion for us. And this same king rose again from the dead, and he calls you to pledge your allegiance to him because he alone has merited and earned your love, your devotion. He died for you. And so if you would come to him, not with all of your achievements, not with all the good things you've done. People, when they seek asylum, they have to give some justification for why they're there. When they want to immigrate to another country, you got to list all of your achievements and accolades. But the kingdom of God is such that you come with your sins in your hand. You come with an acknowledgement that you don't earn or deserve a place beside this King of Kings. And if you will do that humbly, he will accept you. He'll receive you. If you have any questions about that, I'd love to talk with you about that. If you feel like you're a dad or a mom that's just failing at life and at being a parent, I'd love to talk with you. We can commiserate. We can cry on each other's shoulders together. But let this be a moment where we can speak of the things of God and draw comfort and peace from him.